On the website Chabad.org, the most representative, probably, and the most authoritative portal expressing the teachings and positions of Chabad Lubavitch Hasidic movement, I happened upon an article by certain Dovid Margolin dedicated to Lubavitcher Rebbe's Menachem Mendel Schneerson's views of America, its history, its destiny, its founding principles, and so on. I could not resist temptation to comment on some of the things that I found debatable in this article. Of course, I'm known for taking perhaps the upper uh, levels of time and space required to express my thoughts, so the video promises to be lengthy, but so was the article. So in this case, I would greatly appreciate if whoever happens upon this video and actually undertakes to watch it, that they bear with me, preferably to the end. So the very first serious promise in the article looked kind of objectionable to me when Mr. Margolin was telling about his experiences in Sweden and how he did not quite feel as one of Swedes because he was not one of Swedes, because as he puts it, only Swedes can be Swedes, meaning apparently that Swedish people are people with certain looks and certain temper. Historically, yes, nobody would deny that your stereotypical Swede would be a tall, blue-eyed blonde. Though one could also say that there has been an abundance of this anthropological type among Jews, surprisingly, for a Middle Eastern originated nation. But there was a stereotype of a blue-eyed blonde Jew, even in Soviet Union, even in West Europe, in particular in Germany, Poland, and so on, where Jews were especially numerous at certain point in history. So even in this sense, a person can look Swedish but not be Swedish. They may be Finnish, they may be Norwegian, they may be German, Danish, Russian, Polish, Jewish, and so on. So even taken at its traditional understanding, you cannot really say that this is a correct presumption that only ethnically Swedish person can be Swedish. There actually was a very fine Soviet time movie called Trees Grow Even on the Rocks, about a Novgorodian, that is ancient Russian youngster, being taken hostage by prisoner rather by the raiding and marauding Vikings, who is brought into Sweden. Presumably that Sweden of course gave ancient Rus its original ruling dynasty, which actually came through Novgorod. So presumably those are Swedish Vikings. They take this Russian boy or young man prisoner, uh, carry them along to their land. He becomes essentially one of them, but then escapes. But he looks exactly like a Swede, because Russian folk in the north of Russia mostly look like Swedes, or like Finns, or like Latvians, or Lithuanians, or Estonians. But if you were to know anything about modern day Sweden, even if you are not watching the World Cup, which has been going on under our very noses and in our very eyes here in the United States, even if you haven't paid attention to that competition, even if you're not a person that watches sports or entertainment, still, if you are a with it person, which Chabad people claim to be, unlike many other Orthodox Jewish communities, you would know that today's Swedes are not necessarily tall, blue-eyed blondes. There are people of quote unquote African, Middle Eastern, sometimes even Asian descent, South Italian descent, such as Swedish or Portuguese or Greek, many people from Balkans, the of Croatian, Serbian, Albanian, Bosnian origin. Look at Zlatan Ibrahimovic, perhaps the most famous Swedish football player, probably of all time. I'm not a big fan of his, but he's about 7 foot tall, but clearly distinctively kind of Middle Eastern, not even so much Balkanian as Middle Eastern looking man, who happens to be a Catholic, but whose very last name suggests Muslim origin. And he is Bosnian. He's not even Croatian Catholic. He's from Bosnia originally. His parents were from Bosnia. So go figure what he is. Take another outstanding Swedish footballer, Henrik Larsson, or yet even from previous generation, Martin Dahlin, or Alexander Isak, who's clearly African. So even this starting premise that every people have a sort of their tribe and you cannot be anything but that tribe or an outsider, especially in today's world, that is not true, and it's probably not been really true in the history either. Now let's proceed. Jews often arrived in the United States intent on leaving their Judaism behind. This is a semi-accusation, maybe um, a a chastisement, often thrown at Jews that were arriving originally in the United States and many other places where Jews arrived as free immigrants, hoping to become parts of those new societies. Sometimes even in countries of West Europe, such as uh, Great Britain or Canada or Australia or countries of Latin America, which also used to see quite significant Jewish immigration. And I believe this is not fully true. This is not really well based. People were not escaping Judaism as such. People were escaping what was uh, associated with Judaism: the lack of human rights, the lack of development opportunities, the stifledness of the historical Jewish existence in the small cities and villages where Jews were forced to live, in particular in former Russian Empire. This miserable way of life was what people were trying to escape. And they not so much quit their Judaism as reinvented it. And you may think different things of Reform Judaism, for instance, or other forms of Judaism or Jewish identity that were established in the societies such as United States. But in a way that spurred Orthodox Judaism also to reinvent itself and improve itself, and including spurred on the creation of Chabad in its time. Uh, because Chabad is notable for putting emphasis, at least starting with the work of the last Rebbe, putting emphasis on Kiruv, on the outreach to the Jews, and not even limited to the Jews, admittedly, that had been, for some reason or another, separated from their roots. So you could say that the need to compete with Orthodox, with rather Reform or conservative form versions of Judaism was a significant um, uh, impulse for Chabad becoming what it became. Let's proceed. This nation was founded on the inalienable rights of man. True. First and foremost, uh, among those rights is the right of religious freedom, or the right of freedom from religion. I would like to remind esteemed Mr. Margolin that Constitution of United States expressly forbids creation of established church. Religious freedom, freedom of conscience, freedom of faith means that a person is free to choose how they go about their worldview and who they associate with, and if they don't want to, not associate with anybody. Blessed with power, wealth, and moral authority, America cannot choose to seclude and isolate itself, God forbid. Absolutely true. This I totally agree with. And it's interesting to note that it kind of goes against the sentiment of many religious Jews, which is kind of like isolationist in terms of relations between Jewish and non-Jewish world. So often, even from Chabadniks, I hear that, say Hutu and Tutsi somewhere in Africa fighting and killing each other should not be our Jewish business. I honestly thought it is our Jewish business because we are a light unto the nations, and everything should be our Jewish business. The majority of the early settlers were religious refugees who firmly believed in God and in His word. The majority, yes, but there may have been a minority that were atheistic or agnostic. Most definitely, even in 17th and especially 18th century on, there were increasing numbers of people, usually more educated, more independently thinking, that were, among other, critical toward religion, or at least toward religious institutions as they existed at the time, and questioning the existing order. Conversely, the believers we're talking about, the pioneers, so to say, both Gentile and Jewish, were people, even if they were educated, they were people who knew no alternative or almost no alternative to religious worldview. Everything was wrapped in religious terms and elements back then. A passage about different laws and policies. I believe these are all quotes from Rebbe himself. So I am basically debating Lubavitcher Rebbe here, who, of course, was a great sage and a great leader, but nevertheless, who says we are not to question what even the most worshipped and esteemed people in our midst say and espouse. So the passage that it has prevented financial aid, federal, state, and local, to any educational institutions where children are taught to believe in God. Personally, I find, pardon me for saying this, ludicrous. Interesting that this was said some 40 or 50 years ago. These issues have come to light again in recent years, in particular in New York State, which of course is home to prevalent, the lion's share of American Jews, in particular American Orthodox Jews, and there have been controversies with financing the government financial aid to some yeshivas who, for instance, refused to teach in their curriculum such subjects as math, physics, history, even perhaps English language. Um, I do not think this is about religion. I think this is about obscurantism, which needlessly is being promoted or conserved in some Jewish and some probably some non-Jewish, some other religious education institutions too. Such a state of affairs, Rebbe continues, would have been inconceivable to the founders, and there was no way such a reading of the Constitution could be in accordance with their intent. This is very questionable, with all due respect to the Rebbe, because among founders there were agnostics. Among founders there were people who were unaffiliated to any particular religion. Well, if they were religious, they were, of course, Christian, almost to a one, with exception probably of a couple Jewish folk. But some of them were secular, and many were inspired by enlightenment, not only by the Bible and not only by the traditional sort of more conservative, scholastic, if you will, reading of the Bible. Yet some were under impression that, for instance, the United Provinces of Netherlands, established 200 years prior, were inspired by the Bible, by the Old Testament, by the union of ancient Hebrew tribes, and some people saw the nascent American Federation in similar light. But again, what is central here? The biblical aspect, or what is derived as an ideal of societal organization here, which is laid out and may be sanctioned by the Bible, but does not totally necessary needs to be. And about the state of affairs where religious educational institutions, religious schools are denied government aid because they teach God. I suspect that many founders of United States, since United States is the citadel of capitalism, they generally may not have been very pleased with the very existence of government financial aid to what should be theoretically fully private institutions. Here, not on religious or secular, but on economic ideological grounds, libertarian, if you will. Rights of humankind stem not from government, but from the creator. Well, the idea of United States is not that rights of people stem from government, but that the rights of government stems from people. No taxation without representation. But even ancient Romans used to say, vox populi, vox Dei. The people's voice is God's voice. So generally speaking, this is not a contradiction. Um, the creator probably cannot, at least so openly, go against the will of his own creation, to which uh, he endowed at least certain level of autonomy, at least insofar as the creation feels and sees and conceives itself. But again, people in that within that logic, people, even if they do not adhere to any particular religious doctrine, their voice is echoed by God's voice. This kind of reasoning, trying to insert religious element into the foundations of American democracy, often other political systems, is flawed. People who believe in creator are entitled to do so. And we to this day in this country honor biblical heritage by keeping in courtrooms the image of the Ten Commandment tablet, and by having witnesses swear on Bible, or in case they find it impossible, such as Orthodox Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, or atheists, and so on, filing some kind of affidavit, affidavit of faith, in which a person still vouches that they are going to be truthful in their testimony. The fulfillment of the commandments, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal, etc., can be assured and withstand any temptation only if they are preceded by the knowledge that I am the Lord thy God, who brought thee out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. It would be nice if everything were so simple. In reality, it's far from that. One who is familiar with Old Testament knows how many times people lie, steal, and even kill in it for the greater good and with God's permission and sanction. As somebody who grew up in at least formally, nominally atheistic Soviet Union, although a big question could be raised how atheist and secular that country and that society really were, but at least nominally it was fully atheistic. Officially, the official ideology was Marxism-Leninism, scientific materialism, and so on. Religion was not just separated from state, but pushed deep into backseat with occasional, sometimes very heavy repressions. But of course, communism, Leninism essentially was made into a new religion there. Still, I can vouch for this. We, the Soviet people, were raised no less stringently, and I would say no less efficiently, in the spirit of respect for elementary principles of human conduct. Children raised without this awareness will not respect their parents or elders, and neither will they fear the police officer. This is simply not true. There are sadly many outrages committed by nominally religious people, including nominally religious Jews, sometimes very uh, radically or deeply religious, uh, sometimes even against their uh, parents when those do not share the children's zeal or worldview, sometimes even against the law enforcement. Look just at what's been going on in today's Israel and how the ultra religious non Zionist circles behave. Look at the recent events in places like Arad or in West Bank, sometimes attacks on female soldiers, sometimes attacks on police stations or convoys. Um, Look at what was happening some 20 years ago when Gideon Bush, mentally sick Orthodox Jew, was shot in Borough Park by the New York Police Detachment. The local residents had essentially besieged the police precinct. There also were clashes between uh, the COVID-defying or ultra-Orthodox Jews and authorities and law enforcement in New York City during the COVID pandemic. So, unfortunately, this claim that the more religious you are, the more respectful you are of an authority does not check out against the facts. Now, another interesting topic here. To the Rebbe, the Jewish communal position ought not to be about waging a battle against communism, but a battle for the Jews behind the Iron Curtain, whose needs were multifaceted. The Soviet Union may yield under certain conditions to private pressure, but it is inconceivable on general grounds that such pressure should be effective when exerted publicly. The political theoretician Hans Morgenthau wrote. Well, with all due respect, Hans Morgenthau turned out to be wrong. It was public campaigns, sometimes even of extreme kind, such as were conducted by even, say, Meir Kahane and his movement, and also by various politicians, both Jewish and non-Jewish, and by activists, in particular Jewish, but also generally democratic and simply conscientious activists back in former Soviet Union, when they called public attention to the injustices committed against Jewish people, whether against their religious or cultural rights in their country or their rights to immigrate to country of their choosing, whether Israel or United States or someplace else. It was public pressure that ultimately yielded decisive dividends and caused the Soviet levy to break. Sorry. It was Ronald Reagan's public campaign, a crusade, not only the arms race, the gauntlet to which he threw to Soviet Union and Soviet Union was not able to answer it, but also the public campaign, the speeches where he called Soviet Union evil empire, the demands that rights of Soviet citizens be respected, and in particular rights for immigration of the Jews, the so-called prisoners of Zion, be respected. That ultimately yielded real serious results. I can imagine that maybe the matzo that I first got to taste at the age of 10 or 11 was passed on to us, to our big but provincial city of Kharkiv, perhaps from Moscow. Interestingly enough, we used to call matzo Moscow cookies or Moscow wafer. that it was passed on to us by some Chabad emissaries. That's possible, but that was only some tiny, minor pieces of Jewish heritage that we were able to access. Eventually, when perestroika entered its full swing, the relations with Jewish world were normalized. The oppressive regime, the quotas, the badgering, the bullying of Jewish identity was lifted. The limitations on migration were lifted. The cultural and religious Jewish institutions were restored, were allowed to start restoring and started springing up like mushrooms after the rain. And that happened thanks to the hardline and public approach of people like Reagan, like Kahane, if you will, even though on other issues I do not share Rabbi Kahane's views in the least. So, in my opinion, this emphasis on quiet private work is a mistake. However useful quiet private work can be. Israel's population stood at 3.4 million and its size 34,000 square miles. 70% of that land in the Sinai Peninsula, which Israel's leaders would abandon to the Egyptians a few years later in exchange for a piece of paper. Well, first of all, uh, I always was baffled by how unabashed, if you will, the Rebbe was in expressing his views on how Israeli leadership should conduct itself when he never set foot in Israel himself, for well-known reasons, but still. Yeah, you may be a well-educated person. I believe Rebbe held two high education degrees, and one of them, if I'm not mistaken, was military engineering. But still, um, if you are a religious Jewish leader, you should remember that Sinai essentially is not a part of canonical Jewish land. Sinai was the place where Jews were kept for 40 years before entering the actual promised land. So, from that, logically, it follows that Sinai itself is not a part of canonical Jewish land. And to call the Camp David treaty a piece of paper, you could rather call current treaties espoused by supposedly, until recently, presumed to be much more pro-Israeli President Trump pieces of paper. The Gaza treaty, the Lebanon treaty, the memorandum of understanding with Iran, which has been thrown to the basket, thankfully, indeed, by now. The Camp David agreements have worked. They have allowed Israel to breathe freely and not worry anymore about hostility of biggest Arab country out there, the big brother of the Arab world. Yes, it was defeated by Israelis in their wars previously, but with great strain and great losses on Israel's side, in particular in 1973. The Jewish nation is the people of the book, not of the sword. I would say that historically, especially at its most decisive moments, whether modern or ancient Israel have been both Israel the state and Israel the people, the nation, have been both the people of the book and the people of the sword. The amount of military action described in Old Testament is immense. The amount of military action that modern Israel has experienced and engaged in is immense. In modern day, you could say that the Jewish nation is the people of the book and of the gun, not just of the sword. I understand that the book is the ultimate guide and the purpose giver of why Jews should fight. But nevertheless, even while questioning some practices of modern day Israel, and even some actions of Jewish heroes of the biblical time, still, I would agree that upstanding, and in particular, upstanding with uh, arms in our hands, is a recurring theme of our history. Sometimes it's a matter of plain mere survival, and sometimes it's a matter of standing up even for others, um, for allies, for relatives, for just those that you see unjustly persecuted, unjustly treated, and Jewish figures, both in ancient times and modern times, so many times had raised their voice and often their hands in protection of the victims of injustices that I don't really know how could you say that we are not a people of the sort. The Rebbe's frequent call that America not only distribute dollars as aid but export to every corner of the globe, the motto printed on those bills, "In God we trust." This is another problematic point because when you attach this or that religious or ideological message or straining requirement to your aid, first of all, you lead to instability in providing that aid and expectations from the aid receivers, because when you got a more religious and right-wing leaning, conservative leaning administration in the United States, you are attaching requirements, for instance, that I remember during President Bush Jr.'s times, some aid to African countries was um, coupled with requests to support and strengthen the positions of religious institutions, in particular educational. When Democratic presidents were providing financing for programs that allowed, for instance, access to abortions or contraception, the Republican administration uh, um, stop those programs and attach requirement that U.S. aid money actually not be used for such programs and actually be used for spreading of the more conservative worldview. This is not consistent. This is not reliable. And this is really not in line with the idea of providing aid to struggling nations as such. You should be helping people without attaching religious strings or secular strings for that matter. Moreover, that issues of, say, overpopulation, the demographic explosions, and so on, cannot be solved by simply propagating restraint and abstinence. They need to be solved materially. They need to be solved both by respecting people's rights to decide what to do with their body. Although I'm not a supporter of abortion, but you cannot just ban abortion outright, especially in countries where it's a persistent problem. Moreover, you should not be banning or limiting access to contraception, which is anyway not so much Jewish as a Catholic approach. And although I happen to be a great Catholic Church sympathizer, but I also readily admit that they sometimes go too far in different things. Sometimes they get too humane, such as with their modern advocacy for abolition of death penalty, and sometimes uh, by going so far on conservative side as to completely forbid contraception. But in any case, the aid to those needing the aid should not be uh, reliant and dependent on preferences of people in the White House or on Capitol Hill. Uh, Aid should be provided until those countries can stand fully on their two and maybe even pay that aid back. And the last passage that I want to comment on from Mr. David Margolin's article laying out Lubavitcher Rebbe Menachem Mendel Schneerson's vision of America and its constitution and their purpose is this. America is not about tolerance, but about allowing each person the inherent right to actualize their potential and fulfill the unique mission for which God has placed them on earth. Well, first of all, it would have served well to find some kind of brief, at least much briefer than this, term for what America supposedly really is about, because you cannot use this in any meaningful, in any serious disputation. Person will die of boredom before reaching the end of this sentence. But also, it's not really true. America is about tolerance. America is about living freely and doing so until your freedom encroaches upon others' freedom, and vice versa. America is really about what Rabbi Akiva told the Gentile who mockingly asked him to teach him entire Torah while standing on one foot. Don't do unto others as you don't want done unto yourself. Everything else is a commentary. If a person accepts the idea that they were created by God and put on this earth to fulfill certain potential, great. If a person do not find it possible in their intellectual uh, setup to accept that idea, some because they don't see proof of God's existence, some because they see that the world has been so cruel and unfair that it's, they're rather, in their logic, there rather be no God than be such a cruel and unfair God occasionally. After all, let's not forget the story of one of the Talmudic rabbis who quit Jewish religion when he saw a boy who picked up a little bird that fell out of a nest, and he tried to bring that birdling back to the nest, and he fell while doing so and died himself, and the bird died too. So the rabbi said, there must be no justice in this world, and thus there must be no God. So he turned away from Judaism and I believe started serving Romans. Of course, Romans had their own religion, but it was kind of like uh, unassuming. Entertaining, interesting, but unassuming. Pardon me for not remembering the name of that rabbi. I don't believe it was Rabbi Meir, but uh, I think actually David will know better than me. I assume he has full knowledge of Talmud. But the bottom line is America is about tolerance. Sure, there are some things that are not acceptable even by the criteria of the broadest, most liberal, whether you call it liberal, secular, agnostic, or whatever set of ideas and mores. Nobody, even among the most liberal people, advocate for people's right to be running around naked, for instance. But outside of that, America is about tolerance. And you don't necessarily need religious foundation to see a potential in yourself and try to realize that potential. This is beautiful verbal quoting of a teaching that sometimes for people that in particular convert onto it from outside, sometimes greets you much more sternly and treats you much more sternly in everyday life. so that you sometimes forget about you or your children, potential and its exploration. Sure, I don't insist that it's always so, but it's quite often so, often enough to put in question whether the potential of quote unquote religious people, in particular in America, is realized to large and actualized to a larger extent than potential of people who do not see themselves as religious or do not give this issue a thought. America is about tolerance. It's about living and letting others live. And in this sense, I guess I disagree with both the seventh Lubavitcher Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, and his follower, esteemed Reb David Margolin, which will not keep me from wishing esteemed Reb David Margolin and everybody who will get to see this video a good Sabbath and good subsequent week. Thanks for your attention to this matter.